If you've been following climate science for any length of time, you've probably come across the reassuring idea that as we pump more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, plants will obligingly grow faster and soak more of it up for us. It's a well-known and widely touted CO2 fertilization effect, and for decades, a lot of our climate projections have assumed this effect will keep helping us out. But a new paper published in late 2025 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences throws a fairly large spanner into that comforting narrative, because it turns out that many of our Earth system models, the same models used to generate the IPCC's climate projections, by the way, have been overestimating a key natural process that makes CO2 fertilization possible. And once that error is corrected, it looks like plants probably won't grow as much under elevated CO2 as we've been assuming. In fact, the land carbon sink, the thing that saves our bacon by absorbing roughly a quarter of our emissions every year, looks to be noticeably weaker. So what's gone wrong? Hello, and welcome to Just Have a Think. Well, we could do without the soil beneath our feet letting us down, couldn't we? It's bad enough with the oceans deciding they've had enough of absorbing huge dollops of our additional carbon. The last thing we need is for the land-based carbon sink to come up short as well. So what's the problem? Well, apparently it all comes down to nitrogen. Plants obviously need carbon and water and sunlight and a host of nutrients to work their little photosynthesis miracle, and as I'm sure you know, one of the most important nutrients is nitrogen, and nitrogen is not an easy thing to get hold of. Atmospheric nitrogen, of which there's plenty, is completely unusable to plants. They can't do anything with it. The only organisms on Earth that can crack the N2 molecule are certain bacteria and archaea. So instead, plants get their nitrogen from a couple of alternative sources, either from nitrogen already sitting in the soil, usually from past decomposition or from fertilizers, or nitrogen delivered by specialist microbes that convert atmospheric N2 into ammonia in a process called biological nitrogen fixation, or BNF. Some plants, like legumes, form intimate partnerships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Others rely on free-living microbes scattered across soils, mosses, lichens, and biological soil crusts. But biological nitrogen fixation is energetically expensive. Fixing nitrogen requires loads of energy, which means loads of carbon. So whenever plants, or the microbes they host, up their rate of nitrogen fixation, they have to divert a chunk of their carbon back into that process. That isn't free growth, it's a trade-off. Earth system models need to simulate nitrogen availability if they want to simulate plant growth. And because nitrogen fixation is the main source of new nitrogen in natural ecosystems, the models have to estimate biological nitrogen fixation across the planet. The problem, discovered by Kou-Giesbrecht and her colleagues, is that the models have been doing this in a rather crude way. Most of them don't distinguish between nitrogen fixation in agricultural systems, nitrogen fixation in natural ecosystems, symbiotic nitrogen fixes inside plant tissues, and free-living nitrogen fixes out in the soil. The new observational dataset used by the researchers in this latest paper is apparently the most comprehensive ever assembled. There are thousands of measurements in there from forests, grasslands, croplands, and deserts. And when the team used that data to check what the models were doing, the mismatch was really too big to ignore, which means we need to dig into some numbers. According to this latest empirical data, total global nitrogen fixation today is about 120 teragrams of nitrogen per year. What's a teragram? Well, no doubt plenty of you are shouting the answer to that at your device right now, but just for the absence of any confusion for anyone, a teragram is 1 million metric tons. The research data showed that our planet's total nitrogen fixation is made up of roughly 65 teragrams from natural ecosystems and 56 teragrams from agricultural ecosystems. But that's not how the proportions were being allocated in Earth system models that form part of the Sixth Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, or CMIP6, which is a global collaboration that provides core climate projections used by the IPCC and ensures that models from different institutions are tested against the same experimental setups and evaluated consistently. Those Earth system models had agricultural nitrogen fixation at just 10 teragrams, which is an underestimate of about 46 million metric tons. Meanwhile, natural ecosystems were modelled at 100 teragrams, which is an overestimate of roughly 35 million metric tons. Does it really matter what the proportions are though? I mean, the overall total is roughly in the right ballpark, isn't it? Well, according to the authors of this paper, it does matter a lot. Because natural ecosystems like forests and grasslands are the ecosystems that absorb the most CO2. They're the lungs of the biosphere, if you like. And the Earth system models were allocating those ecosystems far more nitrogen than they actually have access to. And that meant, in the models, those ecosystems were able to grow more and therefore pull in more carbon than they can in reality. Why such a large modelling error? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the models don't separate agricultural biological nitrogen fixation from natural biological nitrogen fixation, even though those two processes are governed by very different factors. As a result, the models put the highest nitrogen fixation in the tropics, while real-world data shows the biggest hotspots are in intensively farmed regions like the US Midwest, Brazil, East Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. Models typically estimate biological nitrogen fixation, which I'm going to call BNF from now on, using simple relationships with net primary production, or NPP, which is the amount of carbon plants grow each year, and actual evapotranspiration, or AET, which is the combination of water evaporation and plant transpiration. Some newer models use a more detailed approach called fixation and uptake of nitrogen, or FUN, which includes the carbon cost of fixing nitrogen. Now, even though these approaches differ, they all produce roughly similar global totals, but they all fail to match the observed geographical patterns of BNF. The new global observational dataset shows that for natural ecosystems, BNF increases slowly with actual evapotranspiration or net primary production, but for agricultural ecosystems, BNF increases much more steeply with those variables. The models ignore that difference and use the one single global relationship, which is how we get to our underestimation of agricultural BNF and our overestimation of natural BNF. And in fact, that also affects how models simulate emissions of gases like nitrous oxide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia, and nitrous acid. Most of those emissions come from agriculture, so model mistakes are also distorting the simulation of nitrogen pollution and its climate impacts. These new observations break natural BNF into two parts: symbiotic BNF, which is essentially microbes living inside plant tissue, which they found to be fixing about 28 teragrams of nitrogen per year, and free-living BNF, which includes microbes living in soils and in stuff like mosses, lichens and dead wood. That accounted for about 36 teragrams of nitrogen per year. The models don't make that distinction, but according to the authors of this paper, free-living BNF is very important in barren or dry areas, and so the models overestimate BNF in productive biomes like forests, grasslands and savannas, and underestimate it in barren regions. And because forests and grasslands drive most of the global CO2 uptake, which the science bods refer to as the net ecosystem production, or NEP, the models are therefore artificially inflating the potential overall carbon sink. Clear as mud, eh? The bottom line is that the models misrepresent where nitrogen is actually available, overestimate nitrogen supply in forests and grasslands, underestimate nitrogen supply in farms, misplace nitrogen hotspots geographically, fail to include key differences in how nitrogen fixation works across ecosystems, and overstate how much nitrogen is available to support plant growth under rising CO2. So the team looked at 39 of the existing Earth system models and asked the simple question: how much stronger is photosynthesis under doubling of CO2? And the answer is that when real-world nitrogen fixation data is plugged into what the science bods call the equal weighted mean for all Earth system models, they found that we've been overstating the CO2 fertilization effect by roughly 11%. That might not sound like much to you and me, but in the carbon cycle of an entire planet, 11% is a very big number. When you scale that across decades of CO2 emissions and trillions of tons of vegetated land surface, it translates into a much smaller land carbon sink, which means more CO2 staying in the atmosphere than previously thought. And that is not what we want, is it? Agronomists have known for decades that nitrogen is extremely limiting in these natural processes. That's why we burn natural gas to manufacture hundreds of millions of tons of ammonia every year using the Haber-Bosch process. It's why farmers apply vast quantities of nitrogen fertilizer, and why so much of it ends up polluting waterways and emitting nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas some 273 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year timescale. This separate research paper describes how genetic engineering projects have spent years trying to boost nitrogen use efficiency in crops, but every time they tweak a nitrate transporter or an assimilation enzyme, some other part of the plant's metabolism complains. It's a tightly integrated system, and major gains are hard won. Another recent paper, this one published in December 2025, suggests that we can design microbial ecosystems that improve nitrogen cycling, but only in specific soils under specific conditions for specific functions. It's not automatic, it has to be carefully targeted, and it's certainly not a global solution. So when climate models assume that forests can magically conjure up more nitrogen to maintain increased growth under high CO2 levels, they're assuming something we've never even managed to achieve in agriculture with a century of industrial chemistry and decades of genetic engineering. Turns out nature doesn't hand out nitrogen cheaply. So where does all this leave us then? Well, the new analysis is not some kind of doom-laden portent of a collapsing land carbon sink. Forests will still absorb carbon, grasslands will still grow, and photosynthesis will still be enhanced by higher levels of atmospheric CO2, at least to some extent anyway. But the most realistic estimate is now lower than what many models had been projecting. The land sink is a bit weaker than we thought, the CO2 fertilization effect is a bit smaller than we thought, and the gap between what we emit and what nature can safely absorb is a bit wider. If there's a silver lining here, it's that the researchers also point to the way forward. They outline clear recommendations for how models can be improved, separating agricultural and natural nitrogen fixation, distinguishing symbiotic and free-living pathways, building in carbon costs, and tuning models using real-world experiments. But the message that we should be hearing from research like this ought to be pretty unambiguous. There is no natural loophole waiting to bail us out. If we want to keep conditions on our planet at levels that are widely habitable for human beings in the way they are today, then there is really no realistic alternative to rapid reductions in human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. If you're doing research in this area or related areas, then it'd be great to get your views on these findings. And if you're not doing research in these areas, but you still feel the urge to share your views anyway, then as always, the place to leave your thoughts is in the comments section below. That's it for this week though. A massive thank you, as always, to the good folks over at Patreon and also at the Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal platforms and the YouTube Super Thanks supporters, all of whom enable me to make my weekly videos without ever having to resort to ads or sponsorship messages. Most important of all though, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week and remember to just have a think. See you next week.